think we just recorded a picture of me and my sister, but there we go. Okay, there we go. Oh, okay, guys, bear with me. All that kind of screwed up my screen. Sorry, rookie mistakes here. So then we get into this next part, the part 121 and part 135, obstacle clearance and avoidance procedures. So if you're taking off from an airport that's up in the mountains, you have to be able to depart with clearance avoidance. Sometimes those are going to be mountains, trees, things like that, stuff at the end of the runway. A lot of that's going to be fairly obvious. So when we come in for RVRs here, this is going to be more your taking off. It's going to be, so RVRs, sorry, let me start at the beginning here. RVRs is called runway visual range, for those of you that are not familiar with that. Basically what this is once the weather starts getting down to about 1.5 miles, airports can start reporting RVRs. And what this is going to be a machine on, sometimes there's multiple, sometimes there's just a few. But it's going to be machines that basically shoot lasers and beams at each other to see how far through the maybe fog or any sort of kind of weather that's going on, to see how far you can see. So this is actually going to be in use of our visibility. So instead of reporting 1/2 mile, most of the times, if you're looking at this chart here, it's going to be, can anybody see the, I'm going to put my glasses on, the RVRs for 1/2 mile?
It's up to 4,500 feet on the chart.
1/2 mile looks more like 2,400, unless I may be reading it wrong. Those are pretty small. Basically, what I'm getting at here is those are going to be a live reporting of what kind of visibility is going on at that airport. If you pull up RVRs of an airport with thick fog, these things are jumping around every few seconds, and pilots will actually taxi out there sometimes and sit at the end of the runway, and they wait for tower to say, okay, you have RVRs of this, and whatever that is the legal to go. So they can actually use those to land or depart to make it legal. It's kind of just a different use of our visibility. Does everyone kind of get that?
Yeah.
All right. So this 119.7, the operations specifications, the op specs you're going to hear for basically the rest of your dispatch or pilot career. I know some of you guys were looking at pilot stuff. Basically what op specs means is each certificate holder operations specifications must contain, and it's all of the rules they are allowed to, or they must follow, and all the things they're allowed to do. So there are certain limitations put on different I guess certificate holders is what we'll call it, and they have to abide by those. And so some certificate holders are going to be able to do Cat 2 landings, which is a lower class of landing minimums. Some are going to be able to use different rules for alternates, things like that. It basically is just a set of guidelines that each certificate holder has to abide by. And a certificate holder in this case would basically be like a company that is operating. So like SkyWest is a certificate holder. So in this, certificate holder is basically, yeah, I kind of got ahead of myself here. Certificate holder is going to be some sort of operator, and this certificate is going to be it's an actual operating certificate, and on it is going to be these things: certificate holder's name, the location, the number, effective date, things like that. These are kind of the things that are going to be on the op specs is what you'll hear it called, operation specifications, the op specs. Um, all sorts of different things on these. It's going to be anything from what kind of aircraft they're operating to the kinds of operation they're allowed to do. Um, it's got anything and everything on them. A lot of this you'll kind of see going back through once we get to 121. 121 domestic operations is basically what we're going to be dealing with in this. It's kind of good to go over this stuff and just kind of know a general good idea. Let me pull up the 121s here. Hold on, bear with me 1 second here. I may have pulled up the wrong one. Okay, here we go. Okay, so kind of like, I think Garrett probably went over this with you. If you see something highlighted, that's going to be important. If you see something in the red, those are going to be likely quiz questions and things you definitely need to know. Did he kind of mention that with y'all?
Nope.
Yeah, it's the first I'm hearing about it.
Oh, I hope I'm not pulling up the wrong one and showing y'all something I'm not supposed to.
I mean, it's in the daily folder, so I don't know why not.
Okay, cool. So with part 121, 121 is going to basically be comprised of domestic operations, flag operations, and supplemental operations. Domestic is going to basically be more what we're focused on in here. That's going to be most of your examples, things like that. And those are scheduled within the United States. Those are going to be like what our regional airlines, our major airlines, that's what they're going to be flying mostly within, well, the regionals. Flag operations is basically, that's going to be, starts in the US and somewhere else. It's international stuff. And supplemental is going to be more like your for hire. Those are going to be your corporates, the hired planes, things like that that are not necessarily scheduled, and they get hired for a purpose. And so this 121 kind of goes over all the rules for those three types of operations. Each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations must show that a two-way radio communication or other means of communication approved by the FAA certificate holding district office is available over the entire route. The communications may be direct links via a approved communication link that will provide reliable and rapid communications under normal operating conditions between each airplane and appropriate dispatch office, and between each airplane and the appropriate air traffic control unit. Except in an emergency, for all flag and domestic operations, the communications system between each airplane and the dispatch office must be independent of any system operated by the United States. So does anybody know any types of the communication system that, say, we'll use SkyWest for an example. I feel like everyone's fairly familiar with that, with it being in town. The communication systems that they use to talk with their planes and pilots.
Is that like ACARS? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so ACARS is our main one. For those that aren't familiar, ACARS, think of that as like a text messaging system between the pilot and the dispatcher. For the dispatcher, it's actually on the computer. All we have to do is click on their flight number and we can type them out a message. And for them, it's actually it's a small little box, and the keyboard is not comprised of the letters that are on a normal keyboard. Well, in the order, I mean. So it's actually hard for them to type out messages to us, but it's super easy for us to type out messages to them. We also have things like Delta Radio or AirInc. AirInc is basically like, it's kind of like talking on the phone to them. It's almost weird in a way of how clear sometimes it can be. Other times the connection is not very good. But can you guys think of why it might be important to be able to talk to the airplanes?
Case of like a medical emergency.
Yeah, medical emergency is a huge one for us. So if somebody is in cardiac arrest and they have to get down super quick and they're trying to find out where the nearest airport is, then that's they're going to want to be able to communicate and find out, like, okay, where should we go? Sometimes they're actually not going to contact you if it's a very time pressing thing, but also it's going to be your weather. Weather's huge for us. So weather at your destination airport, maybe the minimums have gone down and you want to give your crew a heads up, okay, hey, fog has rolled in. This actually happens to us all the time at Sacramento during the winters. Sacramento is notorious for rolling out a weather forecast that looks like everything's going to be just beautiful. It's going to be 10 and clear all day, and then all of a sudden, some point in the morning, the fog rolls in and it just gets socked in, and there's like a quarter mile of visibility and 100-foot ceiling, and it just stays there for like an hour or two. So it's good to be able to talk to the pilot and say, hey, things have changed, the weather's rolled in, it's not good. Here's a backup plan that we've kind of devised. If it doesn't come up by this point, then maybe we need to think about going to a different airport. Also, if we have different thunderstorms that popped up, things like that, it's always good for us to be able to communicate. There's a lot of safety of flight information that we can get to them via ACARs, or if we have to, those radios.
Hey, Davis.
Yep.
Can I have you go back? I had some static. I didn't quite hear the explanation on flag. I get domestic, but what was flag?
Flag is
Operations?
basically going to be international. It's very similar rules to domestic, but just international. So it might be, and so the big thing here is like we may have a. It doesn't necessarily go down to company. So let's say Delta Airlines. They've got flights going in and out of Salt Lake City. A domestic operation for them would be Salt Lake to St. George. That's a pretty easy flight right there. It's within the United States. It's just a quick little hop. Whereas a flag for them might be their Salt Lake to, let's see, Cabo San Lucas. I think they do that flight during the winter. So Salt Lake to Cabo. So that's going outside the United States. That would be more of a flag operation. A supplemental operation would be, let's say, I'm probably going to offend you guys, but what's the basketball team in Utah? The Utah Jazz?
Oh my gosh.
Sorry. So the Utah Jazz are flying, and they're going to go play the Atlanta Hawks. That's my hometown team. And so they hire a big jet and to fly them there. That would be a supplemental operation. So it's not necessarily anything that if you're a company, you're only domestic, or if you're a company, you're only flag. It's just the type of operation that's done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. You'll have to excuse my NBA knowledge. Can you guys hear me all
I
right?
guess the question, which is worse, to know or to not know, or to know and not care?
They're both bad.
I've never been one to follow basketball very much, so sorry. That was the only thing I was trying to think of is a sports team that would hire a jet to take them somewhere. So as we were talking about, what is important for us, safety of flight issues that we're going to communicate to the crews, and what kind of weather we're going to use to be able to plan these operations out. These weather reporting facilities are the most important thing for us. So each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations must show that enough weather reporting services are available along each route to ensure weather reports and forecasts necessary for the operation. Except as provided in paragraph B for this section, no certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations may use any weather report to control flight unless, for operations within the 48 contiguous United States, in the District of Columbia, it was prepared by the U.S. National Weather Service or source approved by the U.S. National Weather Service. Approved is the huge word there. Or for operations conducted outside the 48 contiguous United States and District of Columbia, it was prepared by a source approved by the administrator. Approved is also a huge word there. Each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations that uses forecasts to control flight movements shall use forecasts prepared with weather reports in paragraph B of this section and from any source approved under its system adopted pursuant to paragraph D of this section. Each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations shall adopt and put into use an approved system of obtaining forecasts and reports of adverse weather phenomena such as clear air turbulence, thunderstorms, low altitude wind shear, and that may affect safety of flight on each route to be flown at each airport to be used. So the reason, basically what this says is that if the weather doesn't come from the U.S. National Weather Service or an approved source by the administrator being the FAA here, that we can't use it. So we can't use, mom and pop's weather for, such and such here and there because they're just trying to make a buck and give us good weather. This is important because people will try and get weather from all sorts of sources to be able to launch a flight. And each of those weather reporting services, they have to be approved. They have to have just as good of a certificate as the National Weather Service. They have to be a trustworthy company. We've got to be able to trust that they're doing the absolute best that they can and giving us good weather. Because if they're lying to us, then our weather is no good and we have planned a flight off of something terrible. Can you think of why they might ever do that and why being approved is such a big issue?
Terrorists, maybe? I don't know.
More the...
Perhaps.
yeah, I'm sure there are circumstances where that could be. People giving bad information to do ill harm. More so, it's gonna be based around money. So, for, let's say, like Aspen, that's a huge operation for SkyWest, and part of what is so big about that operation for us is that those are really big money flights for us during the winter. So, Delta, United, American, Alaskan, those guys are paying very big money for us to operate these flights into there. And even more so would be the supplemental operations that are going in and out of there. So the corporate jets that are flying in and out of there. Well, those have to be legal to go in order to make it in. So the weather forecast has to be at legal landing minimums for that flight to be able to take off. So if that flight can't take off because their forecasts are not good, they may call up any given weather service and say, hey, for this much money, we want a good weather forecast so that we can take off. And then they may land somewhere else, like a good alternate airport. I know Grand Junction is right next to there. So more so it's about that, and you've got to have weather from a good reporting source. All right. Let's kind of skip down here to dispatch centers. So each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations must show that there is enough dispatch centers adequate for the operation to be conducted that are located at points necessary to ensure proper operational control of each flight. Basically what this is going to say is that, do we have a good enough place to be able to plan flights? Are we going to be able to, watch that flight as it goes on? Are we going to be able to, just like we looked up above, are we going to be able to communicate with that flight? Do we have a good enough equipment to be able to do that? Are we, all sorts of things like that. Okay. A lot of this is going to be very redundant. Okay, so flight following system. Each certificate holder conducting supplemental operations must show that it has an approved flight following system established in accordance with subpart U of this part and adequate for the proper monitoring of each flight, considering the operations to be conducted, and flight following centers located at those points necessary to ensure the proper monitoring of the progress of each flight with respect to its departure at the point of origin and arrival at its destination, including intermediate stops and diversions therefrom, and maintenance of mechanical delays encountered at those points or stops, and to ensure that the pilot is in command is provided with all the information necessary for the safety of flight. A certificate holder conducting supplemental operations may arrange to have flight following facilities provided by person other than its employees, but in such a case, the certificate holder continues to be primarily responsible for operational control of each flight. A flight following system need not provide for in-flight monitoring by a flight following center. The certificate holder's operations specifications specify the flight following system it is authorized to use in the location of the centers. So with flight following, kind of what we're doing here is we've made the flight plan. The flight has departed and everything has gone absolutely smoothly. And let's say we're going to Sacramento here. And actually this happened to me over the winter, which is why Sacramento stands out so much in my mind. I had a flight departing from San Diego, going to Sacramento, and mid-flight, the weather in Sacramento absolutely tanked, and there was no way we were going to land, and we ended up having to divert. And there was not enough fuel planned to even go take a shot at it. It was a very tragic incident. I was a little bummed about. But so I'm flight following. I'm looking at that flight. It's departed. It's on its way to Sacramento. What this is can we watch that flight, and do we know where that flight's going? Is it going to run into any weather? Is it what is their route? Are they changing flight levels? All sorts of things like that. Sometimes they'll have emergencies and they end up landing, and they don't even talk to you, and you'll see on your flight following system that something they've just all of a sudden started descending and they're going into a different airport. So this flight following system is very important to be able to know kind of what's going on in your with your planes in the air. So, where'd it go? Okay, this part B. Certificate holder conducting supplemental operations may arrange to have flight following facilities provided by persons. So sometimes actually in these supplemental operations, there's really not a dispatcher, and they will contract out the flight following to somebody. Sometimes the pilots will do their own flight plan and things like that, and then they'll basically just have somebody at their facility that is just contracted to only flight follow. Most of the time, even when they hire those people still have to have dispatch licenses, or they will at least prefer that you have one when they hire you. So can anybody think of like what these flight following systems, has anybody ever seen one, used one? I know some of you guys have sat in at SkyWest. Do you know kind of what a flight following system might entail? So
is it like Fusion?
yeah, Fusion is the one I'm most familiar with. That's actually the one that SkyWest uses. So basically what it is that on my computer, it's the whole screen. It's a map of the United States. Each plane is just a little plane, and I can have it tell me all sorts of information on that plane. Anything from the speed it's going to the flight level. If I hover over it, it'll show me the active route that it's flying. It's going to have all sorts of weather on there. So if a thunderstorm pops up along its route, I can tell them about it. It shows me all sorts of this stuff that's going to allow me to be able to better prepared for that flight and to be able to provide these information for the safety of flight to pilot and command. Each certificate holder conducting supplemental operations using a flight following system must show that the system has adequate facilities and personnel to provide the information necessary to initiate the safe conduct of each flight to the flight crew of each aircraft and the persons designated by the certificate holder to perform the function of operational control to the aircraft. And the system has the means of communication by private or available public facilities such as telephone, telegraph, or radio to monitor the progress of each flight with respect to its departure at the point of origin and arrival at its destination, including intermediate stops and diversions therefrom, and maintenance or mechanical delays encountered at those points or stops. The certificate holder conducting supplemental operations must know that the person specified in paragraph of this section and those it designates to perform the function of operational control of the aircraft are able to perform their required duties. So when this actually talks about intermediate stops, do you guys understand what that term means? Does anybody, I know some of you guys have flown before, do you know what that means? So most places do what's called hub and spoke operations, most large airlines. And so like with Salt Lake has a lot of airports they fly to, or with Delta, they have a lot of airports they fly to in and out of Salt Lake. It's just a there and back. But there are other airlines that will fly a plane from, maybe San Francisco to Kansas City, but they'll make a stop along the way in, like, say, Denver. And then that plane will continue to fly around. So they can actually do what's called a intermediate airport, which means they can stop and land at, if they're going San Francisco to Kansas City, they can stop and land at Denver, and then some of the passengers can get off, and then more passengers can get on, and then they go straight from there all the way to Kansas City. So Denver there would be the intermediate stop. It's not necessarily the destination airport, but it is a destination for some of the passengers. Basically what this is just saying is that you've got to be able to flight follow. It's one of the biggest things in our job is to be able to flight follow. We're planning these flights, and then we don't just want to send them out and say good luck getting there. We still want to be able to help them out as long as they're going. All right, turbine engine powered takeoff limitations. No person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane at a weight greater than that listed in the airplane flight manual for the elevation of the airport and for ambient temperature existing for takeoff. Kind of what this is talking about is there are certain limitations that the plane is tested to, and what those are is it's going to be in a manual that each aircraft has. And so some of them, like I know a lot of our aircraft are not allowed to take off, and if the temperature is 35 degrees above ISA, just because they don't have the power and capability of taking off in that. Okay. Turbine engine powered en route limitations. One engine inoperative. This is actually a pretty big one here. We plan all our flights based around this. No person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane at a weight allowing for normal consumption of fuel and oil that is greater than that which, under the approved one engine inoperative en route net flight plan takeoff in the airplane flight manual for that airplane, will allow compliance with paragraph A1 or 2 of this section based upon the ambient temperatures expected en route. There is a positive slope at an altitude of at least 1,000 feet above all terrain and obstacles within 5 statute miles on each side of the intended track. And in addition, if that airplane was certified after August 29th, 1959, there's a positive slope at 1,500 feet above the airport where the airplane is assumed to land after an engine fails. So what this is saying, and this is actually on every release I've ever done, this is how people plan flights. If an engine fails somewhere, either in climb or once they're en route, anything like that, they've got to be able to still land that airplane. So this here is talking about en route. So if we're flying at like 32,000 feet and we have an engine fail in a 2-engine aircraft, we don't just want to keep flying around with one engine, because what if the other engine conks out? What we have to do is we've got to be able to drift down to an airport that we're going to be able to land at, and we've got to be able to clear all obstacles, whether it be mountains, buildings, things like that, by 1,000 feet, or with the new airplanes, 1,500 feet, and we've got to be clear of those by 5 miles on each side. Does everyone get that?
Is this talking about the envelope, like the limitations the airplane can handle?
Yes. So basically, if you have engine failure en route at cruise, are you going to be able to, with one engine that goes out, you're going to start drifting down. Can you drift down to an airport and land at that airport by clearing all obstacles by the given height within 5 miles on either side of the airplane?
So with that, is like an alternate route something you plan beforehand, or as you're following the flight following system, is that when you make the plan of where you're going to go down?
So it's all planned ahead of time. Like when we're flying over the Rockies, most of the time there is an alternate planned for an at cruise on either side of the Rockies.
So how do you know when their engine's going to shut down to basically correlate with the plan that you've made? Are there like multiple plans that you set up just in case it fails at this point, or how does that work?
Yeah. So basically, and this actually will keep going. The net flight plan path allows the airplane to continue flight cruising altitude to an airport where landing can be made, clearing all terrain and obstruction by 5 miles on intended track by at least 2,000 feet vertically, with a positive slope at 1,000 feet above the airport where the airplane lands after an engine fails. If the airplane was certified after September 30th, 1958, with a positive slope of 1,500 feet above where the airplane lands. So when you're flight planning, when you're initially putting the plan together, so if you're flying from Salt Lake to Denver, most of the time what's going to happen is the flight planning software is going to do all this for you. But, for me it does. There might be other places where it doesn't. But at SkyWest, what happens is it will actually plan a point where, when you're maybe on top of the mountains at point, XYZ, if you've reached this point XYZ, and you have engine failure, you will continue down to this alternate. Or if you can make it to your destination, then it'll actually just have you drift down. Well, it'll have you drift down to your drift down alternate on one side of the mountains. If you don't make it to point XYZ and you have engine failure, you will end up turning back around and drifting down on the other side of the mountains to your other airport. So there's always going to be that one point of, have we reached it yet? No, we haven't. Okay, we're going to this airport. Have we reached it yet? Yes. Okay, we're going to this point. Did that answer your question there?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. There's always a certain point that you reach where you either go one way or the other, and there would always be two airports that you would be able to drift down to on either side of those mountains. Okay, 121, 195. Turbine engine-powered landing limitations at your destination airport. No person operating a turbine engine-powered airplane may take off that airplane at such a weight that, allowing for normal fuel consumption to the destination or alternate airport, the weight of the airplane on arrival would exceed the landing weight set forth in the airplane flight manual for the elevation of the destination or alternate airport and the ambient temperature anticipated at the time of landing. Except as provided in paragraph C, D, or E of this section, no person operating a turbine engine-powered airplane may take off that plane unless its weight on arrival, allowing for normal consumption of fuel and oil in flight, in accordance with the landing distance set forth in the airplane flight manual for the elevation of the destination airport and the winds conditions anticipated there at the time of landing, would allow for a full stop landing at the intended destination airport with 60% of the effective length of each runway described below, with a point 50 feet above the intersection of the obstruction clearance plane and the runway. For the purpose of determining the allowable landing weight at the destination airport, the following is assumed. The airplane is landed on the most favorable runway in the most favorable direction in still air. The airplane is landed on the most suitable runway considering the probable wind velocity and direction and the ground handling characteristics of the airplane and considering other conditions such as landing aids and terrain. So kind of what we're getting at here is, would we really want to plan a flight to get to its destination airport and it's 10,000 pounds overweight, and if we try and land it, we may end up breaking the airplane? So basically what this is saying is we can't pack on more than the plane can land with. We've got to be able to plan the flight to where it can land safely with all of our payload, passengers, gas, everything like that has to be on it, and it's got to be able to land there within what's the parameters set out by the AFM. The Airplane Flight Manual, AFM. You'll hear people shorten that. The big thing here too is the land at your airport within 60% of the effective length of each runway. So that gives you a lot of wiggle room. That kind of gives you wiggle room if something goes wrong, if you end up, not too long ago, this is a good example, not too long ago, I had a plane that took off, and then the pilot contacted me once he took off, and he says, I think I blew a tire on takeoff. So, do you really want to land at an airport where you may have to use 100% of the runway, even if you have a good tire? Well, you really wouldn't want to do that. You want to be able to give yourself some wiggle room just in case things go wrong. The weather conditions, if you do come in with maybe a 5-knot tailwind, can you still land this plane in adverse conditions? Things like that. He ended up not blowing the tire, and he landed just fine at his destination, just in case you guys were curious. But otherwise, he was basically going to be landing and then just skidding that rim all the way to the end of the runway. And it's not a super exciting thing for either one of us, but it ended up being totally fine. Okay, at our alternate airports. No person may list an airport as an alternate airport in a dispatch or flight release for a turbine engine-powered airplane unless, based on the assumptions of 121-195, that airplane at the weight anticipated at the time of arrival can be brought to a full stop landing within 70% of the effective length of the runway for turbopropeller-powered airplanes and 60% of the effective length of the runway for turbojet-powered airplanes, from a point 50 feet above the intersection of the obstruction clearance plane and the runway. In the case of an alternate airport for departure, as provided in 121-617, allowance made for fuel jettisoning in addition to normal consumption of fuel oil when determining the weight anticipated at the time of arrival. So what this kind of means is the same thing, but at your alternate airport. It's not too much of a big difference there. So crew members and dispatchers. Differences training for crew members and dispatchers must consist of at least the following as applicable to their assigned duties and responsibilities. Instructions in each appropriate subject or part thereof required for initial ground training in the airplane unless the administrator finds that the particular subject is not necessary. Kind of what this initial and transition ground training is going into here is that you have to have initial training on everything, but then if you go into, like, say, a different plane, like you change planes as a pilot or a dispatcher, if you end up using a different plane, you have to have a differences training, and then you want to definitely be familiar with that other type of airplane. Okay. Pilot operating limitations and pairing requirements. If the second in command has fewer than 100 hours of flight as second in command and operations under this part in the type of aircraft being flown, and the pilot in command is not appropriately qualified check pilot, the pilot in command must make all takeoff and landings. That one's pretty well straightforward. Okay, aircraft dispatcher qualifications. I know we went over some of these on the first night. No certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations may use any person, nor may any person serve as an aircraft dispatcher for a particular airplane group unless that person has, with respect to an airplane of that group, satisfactorily completed the following. Initial dispatch training, except that a person who has satisfactorily completed such training for another type of airplane in that group need only complete the appropriate transition training. So that was kind of the transition training that we talked about just a minute ago. Operating familiarization consisting of at least 5 hours observing operations under this part from the flight deck, or for airplanes without an observer seat on the flight deck, from a forward passenger seat with a headset or speaker. This requirement may be reduced to a minimum of 2.5 hours by the substitution of one additional takeoff and landing for an hour of flight. A person may serve as an aircraft dispatcher without meeting the requirement for this paragraph for 90 days after initial introduction of the airplane into operations under this part. No certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations may use any person, nor may any person serve as an aircraft dispatcher for a particular type airplane unless that person has, with respect to the airplane, satisfactory completed differences training, if applicable. No certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations may use any person, nor may any person serve as an aircraft dispatcher unless within the preceding 12 calendar months the aircraft dispatcher has satisfactorily completed operation familiarization consisting of at least 5 hours observing operations under this part in one of the types of the airplane in each group to be dispatched. This observation shall be made from the flight deck or for airplanes without an observation seat from the forward passenger seat with headset or speaker. The requirements of paragraph A of this section may be reduced to a minimum of 2.5 hours by the substitution of one additional takeoff and landing for an hour of flight. The requirement for this paragraph may be satisfied by observing 5 hours of simulator training for each airplane group in one of the simulators approved under 121.407 for the group. However, if the requirement of paragraph A is met by the use of a simulator, no reduction in hours is permitted. So you can't reduce the hours if you're in a simulator. No certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations may use any person, nor may any person serve as an aircraft dispatcher or dispatch airplanes in operations under this part unless the certificate holder has determined that he is familiar with all essential operating procedures for that segment of the operation over which the exercises dispatch jurisdiction. However, a dispatcher who is qualified to dispatch airplanes through one segment of an operation may dispatch airplanes through other segments of the operation after coordinating with dispatchers who are qualified to dispatch airplanes through those segments. This is a whole lot of special wording for saying you have to be trained and you have to do your observations and jump seating. Jump seating is probably one of the better perks of our job. You guys will realize as you get hired that you get to do so much more as a dispatcher as far as, can I go and go travel somewhere? It's really cool. But basically what that means is that every year you have to go complete 5 hours of the jump seating. And it's not just on any airline. It has to be on your own. And there's all sorts of different things in the op specs for different companies that have to be met too. But jump seating is actually really cool. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Where it's talking about segments. How does that work? Does that apply to SkyWest where there's like the EMBs and the CRJs? Would you be like qualified on EMBs but not CRJs, or qualified on CRJs but not EMBs, or is that something else entirely?
So the segments, are you talking?
Right down at the last paragraph that you read.
Oh, okay. Dispatcher is qualified to dispatch airplanes through one segment of an operation, may dispatch airplanes through other segments of the operations after coordinating with dispatchers who are qualified. I think the segments they're talking about here are basically just however a dispatcher is qualified. So I believe what they're talking about here is, so when I'm at the end of my shift, there's almost always like 5 or 6 flights that have not landed yet. And I have to pass those down to another dispatcher. So it's got to be someone who's qualified and also someone who is up to date. I've briefed them on everything that's going on, and then they're going to take that over until those planes land. So that's kind of different segments they're talking about there. It's not necessarily each plane.
Okay, so when they say segments, they actually mean flight segments in process.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Because I was wondering, it seemed to me that I'd seen somewhere that, like, for example, Delta has international dispatchers and domestic dispatchers. And I guess I'm curious whether SkyWest has pretty much any dispatcher is qualified to dispatch any flights, or if there's certain restrictions on, and like, you know, you're in group X and you're in group T and somebody else is in group.
No, that's a good question. So actually, yeah, with Delta, they have different dispatchers for domestic operations and for international operations. Most of the time, the international guys are going to be, they may only have a handful of flights in their shift, but it may take them 2 or 3 hours to make the release, whereas I can knock out like 5 to 7 releases in an hour of our short little flights. So at SkyWest, nothing really is broken up as far as that. Any dispatcher in the room should be qualified to work any desk. When we sit down at our desks, there is anything from flights going from Chicago to somewhere in Canada to San Diego down to Mexico City, going into, it's our flights are basically randomized on each desk, and any dispatcher can work any one. We do have to have however, certain training to go into certain airports. So we have certain mountainous regions that we have to read briefing guides on ahead of time and that we have to be trained on as well. But most of the time that's all done either right around the time you're ending training or right after you've ended training. And so by the time you're put on the floor, you're ready to do those.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah. We do have certain desks that have, like during the winter, Aspen is a really hard airport for us. It can just be very busy. Weather conditions there change all the time. Most of the time we put all of those flights on 2 desks, and so those flights will only be on certain desks. Or we also do the same thing with Alaska during the summers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Cool. Yeah, cool question. All right, let's knock out this duty time limitations, and then you guys want to take a quick break, maybe 10 minutes or so, and then after another hour, we could take a little bit longer if you guys want to grab some food or something. Does that sound good to everybody?
Yep.
All right. So duty time limitations. This is a really big one that you're going to have to know because there's not always somebody standing over your shoulder saying, okay, you're done here or you're done there or you can't be scheduled for this shift. You can't be scheduled for this shift. Most of the time you're on your own. You have to keep up with this on your own. So each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations shall establish the daily duty period for a dispatcher so that it begins at a time that allows him or her to become thoroughly familiar with existing and anticipated weather conditions along the route before he or she dispatches any airplane. He or she shall remain on duty until each airplane dispatched by him or her has completed its flight or gone beyond his or her jurisdiction, or until he or she is relieved by another qualified dispatcher. except in cases where circumstances of emergency conditions beyond the control of the certificate holder require otherwise, no certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations may schedule a dispatcher for more than 10 consecutive hours of duty. If a dispatcher is scheduled for more than 10 hours of duty in 24 consecutive hours, the certificate holder shall provide him or her a rest period of at least 8 hours at or before the end of 10 hours of duty. Each dispatcher must be relieved of all duty with the certificate holder for at least 24 consecutive hours during any 7 consecutive days, or the equivalent thereof within any calendar month. Notwithstanding paragraphs A and B of this section, a certificate holder conducting flag operations may, if authorized by the administrator, schedule an aircraft dispatcher at a duty station outside the 48 contiguous United States and the District of Columbia for more than 10 consecutive hours of duty in a 24-hour period if that aircraft dispatcher is relieved of all duty with the certificate holder for at least 8 hours during each 24-hour period. Okay, so let's go back up to part A of this. Basically what that means is kind of what we were talking about with those flight segments. You are responsible for your flights from beginning to end, unless you can pass them off to another dispatcher, and then they will actually watch them. So almost always at the end of my shift, I have to pass down 5-6 flights, and I basically send an email that says, it tells them the flights I have, it tells them kind of where they're at, it tells them any information about those flights that's important, and then they receive that knowledge, and then they accept it, and I send those flights over to them, and they watch them to completion. So you can't be scheduled for more than 10 consecutive hours of duty. You can, however, work for more than 10 consecutive hours of duty. I know there have been certain irregular operation days at SkyWest where people have stayed. One time we had a full system meltdown. I'm sure Trevin, who else was it that was in crew support? Was it Katie?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys remember this last summer where we were all stayed, everyone was there 4 or 5 hours late, and it was just a mess. So we actually still stayed and dispatched flights for, I think I was clocked in that day for 12 or 13 hours. But eventually they actually sent us home, and because we had to have our 8 hours before the next day. So we can still work more than 10 hours, you just can't be scheduled for it. Okay, so this next one, 24 consecutive hours during any 7 consecutive days or the equivalent thereof within any calendar month. So basically what that means is that you have to have 24 hours off once a week. So you can only be scheduled or you can only work 6 days of the week. But this equivalent thereof within any calendar month, what that means is that you can actually work more days than the 6 of 7 days. So you could work 21 days in a row, but then you have to have 3 24-hour periods off in a row. So you could work 21 on, 3 off. And depending on where you go, sometimes there's a lot of overtime available, and people will actually do stuff like that. They might work 26 days in a row, but then they've got to have 4 days off. Because they're working that much, they have to have the 4 consecutive days off. They couldn't have 3 and then work 1 and then have another. It's got to be consecutive. All right, so let's go ahead and meet back up. Or do you guys have any questions on that?
No, I think we're good.
Cool. Let's go ahead and meet back up at 8:51. And yeah, that sounds good. All right. You saved me there. Thanks. Okay. All right. 121,533 is probably the most important thing about your job as a dispatcher. What this is, this is operational control. This is kind of what I know we've hinted at a few things about this one. I know we kind of talked about who has operational control on the first night. It's between the pilot in command and the dispatcher. Even I said, if you have a diversion, I know I said you can even go to other people to ask them what they say, but they don't have operational control. They don't really have a say in what goes on in the flight. This is a responsibility held between you and the pilot in command. So 121,533, you're going to hear that number a ton of times. Just go ahead and memorize it. Each certificate holder conducting domestic operations is responsible for operational control. The pilot in command and the aircraft dispatcher are jointly responsible for the pre-flight planning, delay, and dispatch release of the flight in compliance with this chapter and operation specifications. So pre-flight planning, delay, and dispatch release. Jointly responsible. The dispatcher is responsible for monitoring the progress of each flight. I know we've talked about our flight following here. So monitoring the progress of each flight, issuing necessary information for the safety of flight, canceling or redispatching a flight if, in his opinion or the opinion of the pilot in command, the flight cannot operate or continue to operate safely as planned or released. Each pilot in command of an aircraft is, during flight time, in command of the aircraft, the crew, and is responsible for the safety of the passengers, crew members, cargo, and airplane. Each pilot in command has full control and authority of the operation of the aircraft without limitation over other crew members and their duties during the flight time, whether or not he holds valid certificates authorizing him to perform the duties of those crew members. So what this is saying is that basically, for a flight to fly somewhere, land safely, it has to be planned by the dispatcher and the pilot in command. The dispatcher is supposed to flight follow, monitoring the progress, issuing any necessary information to the pilot. Canceling or redispatching is kind of a iffy one. Not iffy, but in the real world it doesn't really go as a cancel. So a lot of times you just end up delaying a flight until you do feel like it can operate safely. But basically that means it's up to you to decide whether or not, if there's a huge thunderstorm rolling over St. George, are we really going to have them take off in the middle of a thunderstorm, or are we just going to wait for it to let it pass and then have them fly off? So that's kind of up to the dispatcher and the pilot to discuss and plan things like that. This is the biggest operational control is our biggest thing as dispatchers. Does anyone have any questions about that one? Because that one's a huge one.
Okay, so what if you and the pilot don't necessarily agree? What if he wants to go for it and you're like, no, that's not happening?
You can do that. That's something you can do. So if I send over a flight plan, first off, you don't even have to send the release, and the pilot can't go without a release. So it's a joint responsibility. If you guys can't agree, then it doesn't go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's almost never that the pilot wants to go and the dispatcher doesn't. I have heard of it happening. But so say I have a flight and I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Let's say the thunderstorms thing. There's just thunderstorms, I mean, just all over St. George. St. George is just absolutely getting pounded by thunderstorms. And you call up the pilot and you're like, hey, I want to delay this flight 15 minutes and I want to let this system kind of pass through and then we'll go on behind it. And he says, no, I want to go. I'm ready to go. I don't want to stay here any longer. I want to get out. You can actually just call ATC and cancel his flight plan. And if he doesn't get clearance by ATC to take off, he can't go anywhere. They won't let him off the ground. So you still have control of that situation. Conversely, if he decides he doesn't want to go, he's in control of the plane. He just doesn't have to go.
And it sounds like that one happens more often than
That
not,
one,
right?
yes, that one happens far more often than the other. Okay, we'll spice it up here with a super boring story. So I had a flight from Detroit to Lexington, and this was in February or March, I think. And Lexington had legal landing minimums in their forecast. And he had a good alternate, and he had a lot of fuel to be able to wait around for the current weather to come up. And it was supposed to come up, and he didn't want to go. So he called me up and he says, hey, I want to delay this flight. I said, okay. So let's, why don't we wait until the next METAR comes out, so the next weather report to come out, and we'll see if that weather report has legal landing minimums and see if the weather is trending up. And he says, okay, that sounds good to me. Call me if anything changes. And so I call him. I think it was like 30 minutes later. The weather was coming up. It was trending up, and the current forecast, as well as the current METAR, so what was currently the current weather going on, had come up, and it was of legal landing minimums, as well as the forecast was. And so I call him up and I said, hey, there is nothing holding us back from going. The weather's trending up, and let's go ahead and get this show on the road. Like, what do you say? And he says no. He wanted it to come up even further, and there was nothing I could do about it. So even though it was of legal landing minimums, everything was, I felt like I was making a responsible decision. Weather was trending up. There was still nothing I could do. I can't do anything else. So he waited, I think, another hour until the next METAR came out, and the weather came up even more. And so I called him, told him that, and he was like, okay, that sounds good enough. We'll go ahead and go. So they went down, and by the time they got there, it was like 10 miles of visibility and clear and beautiful. Beautiful day in Lexington, Kentucky. But that's kind of how that can go.
So it's really just kind of working in tandem with each other, basically.
Yeah. And there are times like, so there are other circumstances to where right now is actually a really good one. So Denver is notorious for thunderstorms. And when they have thunderstorms, they end up having a lot of holding. They reroute planes to all sorts of different routes for different aircraft spacing. A lot of times in our CRJ 200s, we are very limited on how much gas we can put on that plane if we have a full airplane. So we may only be able to fit on a pretty close alternate and maybe only 5 or 10 minutes of hold fuel, which is almost nothing for going into Denver. Unless we start bumping passengers to put more fuel on, which we can do. as your that's a responsibility that you have. You can do that if you want to. If you feel that you need to bump passengers to create a safer flight, a safer completion of flight, and that's what's going to make you feel comfortable that that flight is going to land safely, you can do that. A lot of times in this circumstance, you call the pilot up and say, hey, I'm planning this flight. These are the numbers. We've got a full boat, 50 passengers. We're going completely full. There's not much room to put on any extra fuel, but we do have an alternate airport. What are you thinking? Do you want to bump some passengers off and put more fuel on, or are you comfortable going the way that it is? And sometimes you kind of reach a happy medium, and sometimes they're like, no, put everyone on, and we'll run the numbers. We'll take as much fuel as we can, and if we can't get in there, we'll just go to our alternate. But that's kind of some joint flight planning that you will do. Most of the time, you just make the release, and when they get it, they either decide this is okay or it's not. And if it's not, they'll call you up and say, hey, I want more fuel, or hey, I want an alternate, or something like that. But yeah, you guys can kind of work together to create that release in different circumstances. Did anybody else have any questions before I move on from that? I'll take silence as an all good. Okay, emergencies, domestic and flag operations. In an emergency situation that requires immediate decision and action, the pilot in command may take any action that he or she considers necessary under the circumstances. In such a case, he or she may deviate from prescribed operations, procedures, and methods, weather minimums, and this chapter to the extent required in the interest of safety. In an emergency situation arising during flight that requires immediate decision and action by an aircraft dispatcher, and that is known to him, the aircraft dispatcher shall advise the pilot in command of the emergency, shall ascertain the decision of the pilot in command, and shall have the decision recorded. If the aircraft dispatcher cannot communicate with the pilot, he shall declare an emergency and take any action that he considers necessary under the circumstances. Whenever a pilot in command or dispatcher exercises emergency authority, he shall keep the appropriate ATC facility and dispatch centers fully informed of the progress of the flight. The person declaring the emergency shall send a written report of any deviation through the certificate holder's operations manager to the administrator. A dispatcher shall send his report within 10 days after the date of the emergency, and a pilot in command shall send his report within 10 days after returning to his home base. So in situation A, where the pilot in command, the PIC, can take any action that they deem necessary, and that they can basically deviate from the prescribed operations, procedures, methods, weather, blah, blah, blah. So kind of an example of that would be, technically, we don't have any charts for a lot of our airplanes at SkyWest to be able to operate at anything where the temperature is ISA plus 35 degrees. We had, not too long ago, Denver was getting up close to that temperature. It was getting really hot up there. And that might not have been something they could land in. But if a pilot in command had an emergency, they could just go ahead and land if they needed to. Or if the visibility was technically not at legal landing minimum, but the pilot felt that they needed to land at that airport, they could just land. They can in an emergency situation, the PIC can do to an extent what they want. It's kind of cool. If a dispatcher ever is trying to get a hold of a pilot, so an example here might be a bomb threat. So somebody calls into your OCC and says, hey, on flight 1234, there's a bomb and they threaten to blow it up. So at this point, the dispatcher would tell the pilot in command and let him know. And if he can't get a hold of him for some reason, he can actually just declare emergency on his own. And then he would tell ATC, and of course ATC I'm sure is going to try and get a hold of them, and they'll try and figure out whatever they're going to do there. And then if you do declare emergency, you have to send a report of that within 10 days of the emergency.
Do you have to send the report upon request, or is it required to send the report?
You have to send it. It's required. There's typically a lot of paperwork involved with an emergency. I know pilots will talk about how much paperwork they have to do, and they always have to call in, and they have to talk to our shift manager, and there's typically all sorts of paperwork filed. When I was going through dispatch school, I thought this was going to be one of those quicksand things where I was going to encounter it a lot more than I actually do. And I've never actually even heard of a dispatcher declaring an emergency. But if it ever happens, it's one of those things that you would be able to, it's not like they're going to get you at 11 days. You would know that, okay, after this happens, I have to do all these things. It's a very, you wouldn't like forget at 11 days and then all of a sudden just like lose your license. I doubt it would come to that.
So if the pilot declares an emergency, both the pilot and the dispatcher have to write up a report?
No, just the pilot.
Okay, what if the dispatcher files an emergency, then just the dispatcher? Or does the pilot too?
You know, I've never come into that situation and I've never heard about it, but I would assume it would be the same, but it may not. I can actually look into that though.
Okay.
I'm just jotting that down. Engine inoperative landing reporting. Except as provided in paragraph B of this section, whenever an airplane engine fails or whenever an engine is shut down to prevent possible damage, the pilot in command must land the airplane at the nearest suitable airport in point of time at which a safe landing can be made. So you remember how I was talking about earlier, we always are planning if an engine fails? You know, we have to have those drift down alternates where we have to be able to come in at 1,500 feet, 5 miles on either side. This is basically saying if an engine does shut down, we have to land at the nearest suitable airport. So a suitable airport is going to be, we can land there. The AFM says that we can land there. We have weather for there, and so it's going to be like a good alternate. It's not just like a strip of concrete where they could possibly land. In point of time basically means if you're flying over Salt Lake at 34,000, or if you're flying over St. George at like 34,000 feet, and you're directly over St. George, or you can drift down and land at, let's say, Cedar City. Actually, that'd probably be still like too close, but anyway, even though you're technically closer to St. George, by the time you get the plane down in altitude, you're going to be farther away from it. And so you're actually going to be closer to Cedar City. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. We don't really want to be flying around with one dead engine. It's not the greatest thing. Pilots don't really like it either.
Is that something you encounter very often as a dispatcher?
It happens very little. I think I've heard Adam say before that he's experienced it, a handful of times a month, but I've actually never, or when he was at SkyWest, I want to say that I heard him say that he had experienced that. It happened. It wasn't uncommon, but it was definitely not common. I mean, clearly we hear about them on the news all the time. There was the 777 that had engine failure that kind of exploded on its way to Hawaii. You guys remember that one? I'm sure everyone remembers the Southwest one. But those are the reason you're hearing about those are because something happened. It was like an explosion. A lot of times what it is they just shut it down. Like there's some sort of engine indication that comes on and they shut it down and no one even knows. It just all of a sudden one of them goes off and they land. It's not necessarily always a big catastrophic thing. It can be something as little as, a light goes off, they land, and it clears with a reset. So even if it does happen, it's not necessarily a huge deal. I've never dealt with it, if that was your question, and I've never sat next to anyone else who's dealt with it, so I don't think it happens super often. It might be one of those things too where if it happened you wouldn't even know until you were watching it and they just landed somewhere random. Sometimes in emergency situations like that, the pilot will just talk to ATC and say, hey, I need to land at the nearest suitable airport. Where can I go? And ATC will say, here, and then they just immediately start down and they land at that airport. They may not even talk to you before they do it.
Well, if you're watching the plane from beginning to end, wouldn't you see that?
Yeah, you would. And most of the time, like on our Fusion, it'll actually tell you when they divert. It'll give you a notification. It pops up and you see it.
Okay.
Yeah. So you might see it and you may send them an ACARS and say, hey, what's going on? But they may not talk to you until they get on the ground. It's a very busy thing when they're in the cockpit and they're trying to brief for an airport that they didn't brief for before. So if something like this happens and they're looking at approach charts and they're trying to make sure, hey, we can land here, it's it can be a very busy thing. They may not talk to you at all, even if you
would ATF maybe communicate with you?
Yeah. Well, ATC
or ATC, sorry.
They might call our company and tell them. But basically, what's going to happen is it's going to pop up on your flight following system that you have a diversion. It may not say what, but you'll know as soon as they're diverting, and then as soon as they get on the ground, they'll give you a call and they'll tell you why. So it would all happen very quickly. So it's not like ATC would really have the time to call you and like, hey, what do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? Most of the time when something like this happens, they're getting on the ground as soon as they can.
So is it fair to say then that the priority for an in-air emergency would be within the cockpit, and then with dynamic traffic controller, and then for a dispatch to be plugged in?
So basically what they always say, if you're ever in the cockpit and you'll hear them say this, it's aviate, navigate, communicate. So fly the plane to where we're going, and then tell people. They're most worried about landing. If they have an engine failure, they're most worried about landing that plane safely with the passengers on it. They're not necessarily worried about, hey, operationally, like, should we divert here or here? Like to best satisfy these passengers. They will just land the plane as soon as they can. It's very rare that you would be involved in a circumstance like this unless they were in like really bad weather and they needed to talk to you about where they can land. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. You'll hear them say aviate, navigate, communicate all the time, and that's basically what their priorities are. Okay. Dispatching authority, domestic operations. Except when an airplane lands at an intermediate airport specified in the origin dispatch release and remains there for not more than 1 hour, no person may start a flight unless an aircraft dispatcher specifically authorizes that flight. So you remember earlier when I was talking about what an intermediate airport is that it's an airport that I think the one I said was San Francisco to Kansas City, and then they kind of stop in at Denver. Some of the passengers get off, some of them get back on. You guys remember that?
Yes.
Okay. So then if everyone gets off the plane, it is not considered an intermediate airport anymore. So then there's going to have to be a new flight release sent. But if they're on the ground at that intermediate airport for less than 1 hour, they don't have to have a new release. Most of the time, though, the common practice is that they get a new release at each airport they stop at. I can't imagine I would ever want to plan a flight that had a release that, from San Francisco to Kansas City, and you stop into Denver and drop off passengers. Because when you're planning this flight, you're looking 90 minutes to 2 hours out from when the plane departs. So then you're looking at weather that's forecasted for, that's probably a 4-hour flight. So you're looking 6 hours ahead of time at your weather at Kansas City. So you'd definitely want to look at it again and do stuff like that. So most of the time, common practice is that there's a new release sent anyway. But that's the rule. So you don't have to, unless it's on the ground for more than 1 hour. For flag operations. So flag, you remember, is going to be our international stuff. No person may start a flight unless an aircraft dispatcher specifically authorizes that flight. No person may continue a flight from an intermediate airport without redispatch of the airplane if the airplane has been on the ground more than 6 hours. So that one, they just give you a little bit longer of a time. So for those, you make a release, the flight goes, it stops at an intermediate airport, it has their specified time window. If they leave before that time window, they don't have to have a new release. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Cool. Thanks. Domestic and flag operations. No aircraft dispatcher may release a flight unless he or she is thoroughly familiar with reported and forecast weather conditions on their route to be flown. So if you can't see what's going on en route, you should not be sending that flight. You need to know if there's going to be thunderstorms en route. You need to know if you need to plan a route around that, or if there's going to be weather at your destination where you need to plan an alternate, you have to know those things. It's basically what that's saying. Aircraft dispatcher information to the pilot in command. Domestic and flag operations. The aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command all available current reports of information on airport conditions and irregularities of navigation facilities that may affect the safety of flight. Before beginning a flight, the aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command with all available weather reports and forecasts of weather phenomena that may affect the safety of flight, including adverse weather phenomena such as clear air turbulence, thunderstorms, and low-altitude wind shear, for each route to be flown and each airport to be used. During a flight, the aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command any additional information of meteorological conditions, including adverse weather phenomena such as clear air turbulence, thunderstorms, and low-altitude wind shear, and irregularities of facilities and services that may affect the safety of flight. So according to this, did I or was I required to tell my pilot going from San Diego to Sacramento that he is no longer legal to land at Sacramento and that it was completely covered in horrible fog and that it may not be safe to continue?
Yes.
Yes, it's required. So you have to issue any information on the safety of flight. So if he had gotten there and he didn't have enough fuel, so he got there, he sees the weather, he goes down, he shoots the approach, there's no way, and then he gets back up in the air and he's like, all right, we have to go somewhere else. Well, if he doesn't have enough fuel to get to that other airport, it may not be safe anymore. Or if he's landing with, if he does make it to an alternate airport and he's only landing with a very small amount of fuel, that really doesn't give him any wiggle room and may not be safe. So we've got to communicate those things when we're watching and see that stuff. Communication and navigation facilities, domestic and flag operations. Except as provided in paragraph of this section, for certificate holder conducting flag operations, no person may dispatch an airplane over an approved route or route segments unless the communication and navigation facilities required by 121.99 and 121.103 for the approval of that route or segment are in satisfactory operating condition. If because of technical reasons or other reasons beyond the control of a certificate holder conducting flag operations, the facilities required by 121.99, 121.103 are not available over a route or route segment outside the United States, the certificate holder may dispatch an airplane over that route or route segment if and the PIC and dispatcher find the communication and navigation facilities equal to those required, are available, and are in satisfactory operating conditions. So we've got to be able to communicate with them, and they've got to be able to navigate. Except as provided in 121.615, no person may dispatch or release an aircraft for operations under IFR or over the top unless appropriate weather reports or forecasts or any combination thereof indicate that the weather conditions will be at or above the authorized minima at the estimated time of arrival at the airport or airports to which dispatched or released. This is another huge one for us. This basically what this means is, are we legal to dispatch this or are we not? So I know we've kind of talked a little bit about this and some of the other things, like my Detroit to Lexington guy. So when I first sent the release, the flight was forecasted to be legal. So I think the legal landing minimums there are, let's just say it's 200 feet ceiling and a half a mile of visibility. So at my estimated time of arrival, it was projected to be can't remember, I think like 5 miles of visibility and like 400-foot ceiling. But currently, weather conditions were reported at a quarter of a mile visibility and maybe like 100-foot ceiling or something like that. But because it was forecasted in my ETA to be above those legal conditions, we were legal to go. So what we're looking for here is the weather going to allow for us to land at the lowest possible legal conditions to land at the airport? So we're going to be looking at METARs and TAFs. I don't know, some of you I'm sure are familiar with that terminology, some may not be. But basically what that is going to be your reported condition and your forecasted conditions. So we're looking at that weather to make sure that we're going to be able to land when we get there. So if we can't land when we get there, we can't take off. It's not legal to go. Do you guys get that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I think I said it about 3 different ways, hoping that it was going to stick. I might have rambled a little bit. But yeah, basically, are we going to be able to land when we get there? If not, we can't go. This over the top basically means we're going to be flying on top of weather. So like we might be looking out the plane and there's just a bunch of clouds and you can't see anything. That's just kind of what that means.
I got a question.
Yep.
When you said looking at the weather and determining if the weather is good or bad at where we're landing determines the flight we can go or not, is that weather based off what's happening right now or the ETA?
The complicated answer is yes. The cut and dry answer is just your forecast. So
okay.
for very short flights, so we do some flights that are actually under an hour, and those are going to be looking at both.
Okay, so it's probably safe to say that within an hour the weather won't change drastically, but like a 6-hour flight,
Yeah,
it would.
if it's over an hour, we don't have to look at the current weather report for it, like at us at SkyWest. But if it's over an hour, we just look at what it's forecasted to be.
Okay.
Yeah, there are. That is kind of a loaded question almost. There are a lot
No,
of
it's
people
good. Yeah.
that don't want to. You'll run into a lot of pilots who do not want to depart unless the weather is reported as legal at the time of departure. And there are a lot who are like, oh yeah, we'll trust the forecast and hope it comes up.
Okay.
And that may actually depend on how you flight plan. There are some airports that are notorious for putting out forecasts that it's going to come up and the weather's going to be just grand and wonderful. And they don't. And the fog may linger for hours after it's supposed to already leave. So you may plan alternates based around that, or plan accordingly as to what you may think is going on. That's kind of your part as a dispatcher, is do you think that this flight can operate safely to that destination even if it's not reported as legal currently?
All right.
Yeah, you can take a lot of things into consideration, and you'll look at a lot of weather charts, and a lot of the biggest part about our job is basically trying to predict the weather, and sometimes we do really good and sometimes we don't. But legally, it's the forecast. Okay, so here we've got alternate airport for departure. If the weather conditions at the airport of takeoff are below the landing minimum and the certificate holder's operations specifications for that airport, no person may dispatch or release an aircraft from the airport unless the dispatch or flight release specifies an alternate airport located within the following distance from the airport of takeoff. Aircraft with 2 engines, not more than 1 hour from the departure airport at normal cruising speed and still air with 1 engine inoperative. So this kind of goes back to, I kind of not glossed over it, but went over it a little faster in our part 91 at the very beginning of if we don't have good takeoff minimums, should we still take off even though we may have an emergency and have to come back and land at that airport? Or do we want to specify maybe an alternate airport if the conditions are not legal? So at SkyWest, our op specs, we can actually take off at an airport. If they are reporting RVRs, we can take off at 600, 600, 600. So the first third of the runway is reporting 600 RVR, the second third and the third and the last third are all reporting 600 RVR. We can actually take off. Or if the pilot has adequate visual range, we can take off. But we have to legally have a takeoff alternate on there, and it has to be this not more than 1 hour from away at normal cruising speed and still air with 1 engine inoperative. So just in case you take off and all of a sudden you have engine failure or you have some sort of emergency, I think somebody said medical emergency earlier, then you have to land. You may not want to turn back around and land at that airport unless they have good legal minimums. So for our destination, alternate airport planning for a destination. No person may dispatch an airplane under IFR or over the top unless he lists at least one alternate airport for each destination airport in the dispatch release. When the weather conditions forecast for the destination and first alternate airport are marginal, at least one additional alternate must be designated. However, no alternate airport is required for at least 1 hour before and 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival at the destination airport. The appropriate weather reports or forecast or any combination of them indicate the ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport elevation and visibility of at least 3 miles. This one's huge for us. So this is called the 1-2-3 rule. So if your ETA is, we'll just say 5 o'clock, you're looking at an ETA window of 1 hour before and 1 hour after. So from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock, we have to have at least a 2,000 foot ceiling and 3 miles of visibility to not need an alternate.
So you're saying that's the minimum?
Yeah, so that's the minimum. Sorry, Adam just texted me. So I'm going to pull up here. So let's see. I'm going to pull up some TAFs here so we can look at these. Hopefully I can find some bad weather. Okay, so what we're looking at here.
Always have bad weather.
What'd you say?
Said go to Hilo, Hawaii. They always got bad weather.
Hilo. Actually, they probably do. Do you know their airport code?
I think it's H&L.
H&L to Oahu.
Oh, is that
Oh,
Hawaii,
it's
huh?
Kona's KNA and Hilo is I don't remember.
Hilo is, oh man, what is it?
ITO.
Yeah, Hilo's ITO.
ICO.
IT.
T as in Tango.
Oh, okay.
But it's going to be PHTO is what it will really be.
I don't typically do many Hawaii ones. Oh, there we go. Nice. Okay. So when we're looking at this, does everyone know how to read a TAF? I'm assuming not.
Yeah, we haven't learned how to read it yet, so most of us don't know.
Okay. So let's look at this one down here. You guys can see this. I'm highlighting it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
So this TAF, can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay. So my cursor right here, this 00 time, that's when this TAF was put out, and it is good until this 24. So if my ETA is anywhere from 1 hour before this line, so we have less than a, oh man, we haven't even gone over sky conditions yet either. I think we're doing that later on. So we're going to look at this line right here. Just ignore that it says tempo. We'll go into that later. So what we're looking at is from 00 to 03 Zulu. So on this thing, because of this broken 600, we would be required to have alternates on this from 23 Zulu the day before until 4 Zulu on this day. Do you guys understand that? An hour before, an hour after. So if our ETA was 030 on this, we would be required to have an alternate because we have a broken sky condition of 600. Even if our alternate, or even if our estimated time of arrival was 0330, so even after this condition right here, we would still be required to have it because the hour before window has the bad weather. So that's just in case it doesn't come up. We'd have to have the alternate. Do you understand that?
Yeah. I know.
Okay. So 1 hour before, 1 hour after, we have to have at least a 2,000-foot ceiling and at least 3 miles of visibility.
Okay.
That's a huge one for us. We have to have that one. That one's all these ones in red. Remember, you got to memorize. Those are the ones that you're going to be tested over. Those are the big ones. Those are the ones we're really going over here. Does anyone have any questions on that? I know we're going to go over weather later, and it's going to make a lot more sense to you.
For these ones we have to memorize. Do we need to know the actual part number too? Like 121.619?
So you're not necessarily going to have to like memorize them word for word, but you need to know what they say. You're going to need to know the information. You know, if they ask about what the 1-2-3 rule is, or if they ask about when do you need an alternate, you need to know 1 hour before, 1 hour after. Your ceiling has to be at least 2,000 feet, and your visibility at least 3 miles.
So it's not going to be what does part 121.619 say?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be pretty brutal.
That would be hard to have to memorize the dictionary.
Yeah, that would be pretty mean. All right.
You said 2,000 feet?
2,000 feet.
Okay.
And that's our domestic operations. That's mainly what we're focusing on here.
And that's the minimum requirements for
So if you're ATA, so if at your ETA, the ceiling is 1,900 feet, but you've got 3 miles of visibility, you still need an alternate. If 1 hour before your estimated time of arrival, you have a 1,900 foot ceiling, you still need an alternate. If you've got 2,000 feet and 3 statute miles of visibility, you don't technically need an alternate.
Okay.
If you have the 3 miles, you don't need an alternate. If you only have 2.5 miles, you need an alternate. I hope I've made that one clear. Is anyone at all confused on that, or?
No, I think you explained it pretty good.
Okay. We'll go with that at least.
I mean, hell, if I understand it, I know you did pretty good.
All right. So there's tons of stuff on here about alternates for supplemental operations as well as ETOPS. There are so many different things on here. What we're mainly focusing on is the domestic. Oops, sorry. Okay. Alternate airport weather minima. Except as provided in 121.624 for ETOPS alternate airports, no person may list an airport as an alternate in the dispatch or flight release unless the appropriate weather reports or forecasts or any combination thereof indicate the weather conditions will be at or above the alternate weather minima specified in the certificate holder's operation specifications for that airport when the flight arrives. So what this means is that if we list an alternate and the weather there is not at alternate minimums, we have listed an illegal alternate. That is not a good alternate. But if we are looking for alternates, what we have to do is we have to go in and we have to add. It's like at SkyWest, we have to add. Well, there's all sorts of stuff. We'll actually get
What?
into that, but there are different alternate minimums. Go ahead.
What if all your alternates are all jacked up? They're all the same. What do you do? What if
Well,
they all have bad weather?
if you can't possibly fit on a legal alternate onto that flight, then you can't go. You have to have a good alternate. If you need an alternate, you have to have a good alternate.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just wondering if.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, I've planned a fair amount of flights into places where there's bad weather just everywhere around it, and I'm limited on fuel, and I've never actually come in contact with that. I keep thinking I'm going to, but
Yeah.
so in the winter, Detroit is a huge one for us for that, because Detroit will actually get a lot of fog, and the fog will create like just. I mean, there might be a big low pressure system sitting right over it, and it'll just create bad weather. The entire state of Michigan, Ohio. Sometimes you have to start looking in New York for good alternates, or you've got to go like back to Indianapolis, or like maybe all the way over to Wisconsin for a good alternate. And it's a huge pain. And sometimes your alternate airports will actually be totally fine, and then they come out with a new weather report, and it's completely illegal, and you have to contact the pilot, and you've got to change it. But there's I can't think of a time where someone was not able to get one on there. But if you weren't able to get one on there, then you can't go. Okay, continue in flight into unsafe conditions. No pilot in command may allow a flight to continue toward any airport to which it has been dispatched or released if, in the opinion of the pilot in command or dispatcher, the flight cannot be completed safely unless, in the opinion of the pilot in command, there is no safer procedure. In that event, continuation toward the airport is an emergency situation as set forth by 121.557. If any instrument or item of equipment required under this chapter for the particular operation becomes inoperative en route, the pilot in command shall comply with the approved procedures for such an occurrence as specified in their certificate holder's manual. So if the pilot's on his way to an airport, basically he can continue toward that airport if he feels that it is still safe to do so. So maybe if he's going somewhere, we've got a few airports up in northern Michigan that we operate to. One of them is Pelliston. Pelliston is not super close to many other places. Let's just say that he's on his way up to Pelliston, and in your circumstance, maybe there was only one good legal alternate anywhere near him, or anywhere near Pelliston, and he's halfway there, and that alternate goes illegal. And Pelliston's weather is it's iffy. But it's definitely not something that you'd want to go up there with no alternate with. In this circumstance, you may want to turn back around and go back to where you came from. Hopefully, it's still got good weather. You may divert immediately and find a safer place to go to, just because you don't want to get up there with no alternate, and then all of a sudden, if it goes from, barely legal to land to not even close, and you've got nowhere to go, that's not a position you would want to be in. So you may start thinking about diverting immediately if that weather went bad. Inoperable instruments and equipment. No person may take off an airplane with inoperable instruments or equipment installed unless the following conditions are met. An approved minimum equipment lists exist for that airplane. So, can airplanes fly with broken stuff?
As long as it's not on the minimum equipment list.
As long as it is on the minimum equipment list, yes. So they'll call this the MELs, minimum equipment list. So they may have a GPS deferred, and the GPS will have an MEL number, and it'll be it'll be like a 6-digit number. And even though it's broken, if it has an MEL number and it's on the minimum equipment list and it's approved to go without that, they can still go without it. And planes go with stuff broken all the time. And basically what this MELs is going to be is it's going to be almost everything on the plane. And there's so much stuff that you can go while it's still broken. I mean, we can go with a thrust reverser out. We can go with... there are sometimes where we'll go without a anti-ice system. But as long as it is still safe to do so. There are a lot of things that are in the MEL number, like that are required by the MEL that you have to look for. So like if the anti-ice system's out, we can't go into known or forecasting icing conditions. Kind of interesting I didn't know this before I started dispatching. I thought when you got on a plane, that plane was perfect. But in reality, most of the planes you get on, there's a lot of times there is something wrong with them. So, yes, you're right. We can still go. There are no-go items, though. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Nope.
Cool. All right, how about we talk about icing conditions, and then we'll take a bit of a dinner break, a little bit longer, and then we'll come back. And I think we're pretty far through. I think we'll be able to finish up after that. So operating into icing conditions. So does anybody know anything about what icing can do to an airplane as far as how it can...
Can affect the wings.
Say that one more time?
It'll affect the aerodynamics of the plane and make it fall out of the sky.
Absolutely. Yeah, they can drop right out of the sky if they get too much icing on them. It decreases lift. It increases drag. It's going to decrease performance.
Yep.
It can throw all sorts of stuff out of whack. It's a huge problem for general aviation that may not have anti-icing systems. For us, it doesn't have to be a huge problem. Sorry, at SkyWest, I guess it doesn't have to be a huge problem as long as we stay out of severe icing. But it's a big thing that can take a lot of people out of surprise. They don't really think about it. But when you're flying through clouds, I mean, that is moisture in the air, and if that's freezing to the wings, eventually, I mean, you could actually just drop out of the sky. You could stall and start going down. So it's something that we have to be very wary of, watching for PIREPs, watching for icing conditions, things like that as a dispatcher. So no person may dispatch or release an aircraft to continue to operate an aircraft en route or land an aircraft when, in the opinion of the pilot in command or aircraft dispatcher, icing conditions are expected or met that might adversely affect the safety of the flight. No person may take off an aircraft when frost, ice, or snow is adhering to the wings, control surfaces, propellers, engine inlets, or other critical surfaces of the aircraft, or when the takeoff would not be in compliance with the paragraph C of this section. Takeoffs with frost under the wing in the area of the fuel tanks may be authorized by the administrator. Except as provided in paragraph D of this section, no person may dispatch, release, or take off an aircraft any time conditions are such that frost, ice, or snow may reasonably be expected to adhere to the aircraft unless the certificate holder has an approved ground de-ice anti-ice program in its operation specifications, and unless the dispatch, release, and takeoff comply with that program. The approved ground de-ice anti-ice program must include at least the following items. And this basically goes into talk about all sorts of things, from what type of de-ice fluid they're using. Certain de-ice fluids can basically only get some ice off. Some of them have much longer times where they'll actually stay on the plane and they won't allow ice to form while they're taxiing out. Different things like that, and that's what this holdover time is talking about down here. So I actually found this video of severe icing conditions earlier. If you So hold on, if we back up and look at this engine cowl right down here, when we start looking at this, I'm sure we're probably looking at icing on these propellers too, so that's going to be decreasing performance. It's going to be decreasing our aerodynamics here. It's going to be creating a lot more drag. We're not going to be getting as good of performance out of this plane. It's going to be a whole lot heavier. It's going to be getting bogged down, pulled down. And then this one is actually amazing. Once they go up to the front, if you even look at all the ice on the windshield, I mean, it would be, if you were coming in thick fog, it would be hard to see through that just to land.
Wow.
Yeah, I guess they landed, but because we have the video.
Yeah.
Hopefully they flew out of this cloud and into some sunshine and it all came off.
They probably had to change their pants.
Probably so.
Uh,
They show a little bit more if we keep watching here. It's
wow. Where was that at? Was that in Alaska or something?
I'm probably in Alaska. Does that make you want to go up there and fly Alaska bush planes?
Oh, Jesus.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
There's actually some pretty scary stuff when the ice comes off the propeller. It can smash it. Well, it does smash into the fuselage of the aircraft. That's why there's little extra layers of, I guess, skin right there, and it just sounds like you're getting like it's like I can't even explain it, but it's so loud when that ice is coming off the propeller.
Ice is can be very dangerous. It looks almost impressive that this plane is still in the air. It can affect the flight a whole lot. I've actually been sitting next to a guy, and he had a flight flying into Toronto this past winter, and severe pyreps kept popping up right outside Toronto on their approach, and he almost had to turn his flight around, but then his flight was about an hour out, and about 30 minutes later, he kept calling Toronto ATC and was like, okay, like, what are the reports now? What are the reports now? Because we can't operate into that sort of severe icing. And ended up like 30 minutes later, they were like, okay, they're just reporting like just moderate icing now. So, and he ended up being fine, but it can be a very serious thing. Okay, so, oh, by the way, I think I told you guys the last time a bogus time to report back because I'm on East Coast time right now. So it's 8:04 y'all's time right now, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so let's come on back at 8:35. You guys want to take a bit of a break, and then once we get back, we're just going to hammer all the rest of the stuff out.
Yeah.
Does that sound
Sounds
all
good.
right?
Can't imagine it taking that much longer.
I think, yeah, we may actually be done early. I don't know. Don't bank on it, but we might. I'll try.
See you in
Sweet.
30 minutes.
All right,
Sounds
see you
good.
guys in 30 minutes.
Yes.
All right. Cool. Let's finish this thing up. Okay, original dispatch or flight release, redispatch or amendment of dispatch or flight release. It's a mouthful. A certificate holder may specify any regular, provisional, or refueling airport authorized for the type of aircraft as a destination for the purpose of original dispatch or release. No person may allow a flight to continue to an airport to which it has been dispatched or released unless the weather conditions at an alternate airport that was specified in the dispatch or flight release are forecast to be at or above the alternate minimum specified in the operation specifications for that airport at the time the aircraft would arrive at the alternate airport. However, the dispatch or flight release may be amended en route to include any alternate airport that is within the fuel range of the aircraft as specified in 121.639 through 121.647. So if we're en route to our airport and we need to change our alternate, we can change it. So if we're heading to, let's say we're going Salt Lake to St. George. And St. George is supposed to be a 1,900-foot ceiling within our ETA window, within the 1 hour before, 1 hour after. So we need an alternate. And let's say on the way, during our initial planning stage, we decided Las Vegas was going to be our alternate. And so we planned for Las Vegas. And let's say we get, like, as soon as our flight departs, they're climbing up in the air, and then all of a sudden Las Vegas does not meet our alternate weather minima anymore for an alternate airport. We can change that in the air to, let's say, Cedar City. If Cedar City has good alternate weather minimums, then we can just change it. What we'll do is we'll contact the pilot. We'll give him a new fuel burn, new weather, and information for Cedar City, and we can just change it. There's nothing that, it's within our fuel range. It's actually closer than Las Vegas is. So we can do that. And we would have to do that if Las Vegas went illegal. Fuel supply. All domestic operations. No person may dispatch or take off an airplane unless it has enough fuel to fly to the airport to which it was dispatched. Therefore, to fly to and land at the most distant alternate airport required for the airport to which dispatched, and thereafter to fly for 45 minutes at normal cruising fuel consumption, or for certificate holders who are authorized to conduct day VFR operations in their op specs and who are operating non-transport category airplanes types certified after December 31st, 1964 to fly for 30 minutes at normal cruise fuel consumption for day VFR operations. Okay, don't blink while we're talking about fuel, because the FAA really doesn't specify that much about fuel. Basically what this is saying is we got to be able to fly to our alternate, or we got to be able to fly to our airport, and then we have to fly to our alternate, our most distant alternate, and then we have to be able to fly around for 45 more minutes, and that's the fuel that has to be planned for our domestic operations.
So that's the minimum amount of fuel you can put on board is 45-minute flight extra.
Yes, that's the minimum that has to be planned, unless you're a day VFR non-transport category airplane.
Okay.
So, and actually, you don't have to have alternate fuel if you don't have to have an alternate. So, if you can legally go without an alternate, you don't even have to have the alternate fuel.
Well, what does that mean? Like blue skies for like 3,000 miles around your destination, or what?
1 hour before, 1 hour after, we have at least 200-foot ceilings and 3 miles of visibility.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's when we don't need an alternate.
Okay. That's true. That's what you said earlier.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah.
Can I jump in, Davis?
Hey, Garrett.
Hey, what's up, guys?
How's it going?
Yeah, pretty good. Sorry, got done with class early tonight. So, one way that we remember this this minimum fuel supply is what we call it. So, if you're ever asked, like in a practical test or anything like that, if you get asked, the way we remember it is burn alternate reserve. So, we call it, the acronym is BAR. So, with burn alternate reserve, that's to the destination. I mean, sometimes they're going to ask you to recite it as the FAR states it. So they're going to say, to the destination, then to the furthest alternate, and 45 minutes of cruise. So that's the way they want to hear it sometimes. And then if they ever ask, what is the acronym associated with that, you can just say BAR. So burn alternate reserve. So.
And that's associated with I don't know what the hell. I freaking got brain fart. What's that associated with again?
Domestic operations.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is FAR 121. I'm sure Davis has already said this, but FAR 121, that's basically any, regularly scheduled flight. So we're talking SkyWest, Delta, any of our main airlines or any of our airlines that are regularly scheduled flights. This is the rule that applies to that. So that 121-639. So.
Okay.
All right. Does anybody else have any more questions on that? Okay. The next basically goes into more like flag and supplemental operations. There's going to be different things for so many different things on this, but mainly what we're worried about here is that domestic operation. So factors for computing fuel required. So I said don't blink when we start talking about fuel because the FAA really doesn't say too much about fuel. That's the big thing where a dispatcher comes in. So each person computing fuel required for the purposes of this subpart shall consider the following: wind and other weather conditions, anticipated traffic delays, one instrument approach and possible missed approach at the destination, any other conditions that may delay landing of the aircraft. So of course, wind and other weather conditions. Wind is going to be calculated in our burn. You guys are going to go into that when we start planning with our extended flight plans and things like that. Other weather conditions are going to be things like thunderstorms, anything en route, anything that may hit our destination. Anticipated traffic delays. It's going to be stuff with like ATC. instrument approach, possible misapproach. So that's going to be maybe if we have like really bad weather at our destination and they maybe have to do a misapproach. Garrett, do you have, I mean, I'm sure we could go on all day about different things to add on fuel for, but do you have much else to add to that?
I mean, not necessarily as far as like, you know, like I said before yesterday, the FAA is really good at, you know, not taking the blame for anything. So they put that little caveat in there. Any other condition that may delay the landing of an aircraft, that's just them saying, hey, we told you, you know, to look for every reason to add fuel. The way, so this is a very common interview question. This is a very common test question. I would say the way I remember fuel is every time a pilot calls me, they're typically crying about fuel. So WAA is the acronym, WAAA. So wind and other weather, anticipated traffic delays, an approach and possible misapproach at the destination, and then any other reason, you know, that may delay the landing of the aircraft. That's the way I remember it. I'm a big acronym guy. So that's the way, you know, if you guys want to write that down on like a flashcard or something, that's one that I would highly recommend you guys study and memorize the way that the FAA writes it down.
Could you say that one more time?
Yeah, so it's just the WAA, WAAA is our acronym because the pilots are crying about fuel. Wind and other weather conditions forecast, and then anticipated traffic delays, then an approach. I just say an approach and a possible missed approach at the destination. And then I say any other reason that may delay the landing. So, you know, as long as you're saying it as close as you can to the FAA language, the FAR language, you know, nobody's ever going to really hold it against you. But you want to be close. You don't want to just like be pulling these out of a hat. So that's kind of what I got.
Yeah, I actually couldn't remember that. The acronym. It just I was never one to really remember acronyms, so I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, I mean the first time I sat through the course, you know, Adam's first time teaching the course, he man, we literally read every single FAR that we've gone through now. We spent an entire semester going through just FARs, reading a dictionary.
Oh.
And when it came to test time, it was like nobody could pull any of this out of their hat. So, you know, I had another instructor that was like, you know, acronyms, and that's what helped me. Some people, it's like it doesn't help, but I'm too visual of a learner. So.
Okay.
Hold up on that real quick.
Okay.
I'm almost done writing it down. Go down a little time. Oh, yeah, right there. That's good.
Yeah, I actually don't know how to get that copy of copy thing out of the way. I tried really hard during the break, and
I ain't messing with it.
I don't know how either. I mean, are you on a Mac or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these all changed since I pulled up the other one and it didn't have the red boxes, and I was like, oh no, because I looked over everything this morning, and then I was like, I gotta find the one with the red boxes.
Yeah, the part 91 we didn't go through an outline because that part 91 part it also has some of 116 in it and a couple of we basically went through and pulled out only the pertinent FARs out of those sections. So
yeah, a lot of the part 91 gets reiterated too in the 121.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing to remember is Part 91 is general aviation. With sorry,
Bless
as
you.
you're going through the course, the Part 91 is your general aviation. So those are the rules that apply to your general, pilots just flying around in the sky. Part 121 is air carriers only, certificated
Yeah.
air carriers. So 135, we call those supplemental. You'll see a lot of the rules transition or are the same through each one of those FARs, but at the same time, you'll find a lot less restrictive rules on 121 flights versus Part 91 flights versus 135 flights. So 121, you typically have the least amount of restrictions.
All right, I'm good.
And when I say least amount of restrictions, I don't mean that like less rules. I mean like, visibility and stuff like that. They're allowed to go down to lower. Does that make sense? Less restrictive, but probably more total rules.
It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But I kind of know more about things.
Yeah.
I think more what you're saying is they're allowed to hit more minimums. They're allowed to really kind of push the edge of the rules.
Exactly. Legally too, Part
Yeah.
91, the guy tries to go down to, Cat 1 landings. It's not legal. So, I mean, the envelope kind of opens up for 121 pilots where they have a little more room to play. So that's all I got. So
Cool. So see, that's actually basically the end of our FAA regulations on fuel. That's where I was saying is the dispatcher comes in so much at play there with what we're trying to plan. And like Garrett was saying, that caveat at the end, any other, they're kind of covering themselves there. And that's where it kind of comes back on the dispatcher of, did you take this into account? Did you take this into account? There's a lot of things that we have to look at as a dispatcher, an hour and a half, 2 hours ahead of time to be able to make those decisions. So takeoff and landing weather minimums, IFR. This is for all our certificate holders. Remember, all our certificate holders, that's like our airlines there. That's kind of what that's saying is that's SkyWest, Delta, Southwest, Alaskan, American. Notwithstanding any clearance from ATC, no pilot may begin a takeoff in an airplane under IFR when the weather conditions reported by the U.S. National Weather Service, source approved by that service, or a source approved by the administrator, are less than those specified in the certificate holder's operation specifications. Parts 91 and 97 of this chapter, if the certificate holder's operation specifications do not specify takeoff minimums for the airport. Except as provided in paragraph D of this section, no pilot may continue an approach past the final approach fix, or where a final approach fix is not used, begin the final approach segment of an instrument approach procedure. At any airport, unless the U.S. National Weather Service, a source approved by that service, or a source approved by the administrator, issues a weather report for that airport, and at airports within the United States and its territories, or at U.S. military airports, unless the latest weather report for the airport issued by the U.S. National Weather Service, a source approved by the service, or a source approved by the administrator, reports the visibility to be equal to or more than the visibility minimums prescribed for that procedure. For the purpose of this section, the term U.S. military airports means airports in foreign countries where flight operations are under the control of U.S. military authority. So, basically, to have the takeoff and landing weather minimums that we have, they have to be by one of these approved sources. And the approved sources is kind of what we were talking about earlier. We have to have good weather. And we've got to be able to take off at an airport to where we're either we can come back and land there in an emergency, or we have to have a takeoff alternate, or our intended flight plan to our destination where we can land at our destination. So this here just kind of goes into the visibility and the instrument procedures and things like that. Kind of some of the stuff that you'll see that may affect our landing minimums, some of the lights, markings on the runways, stuff like that.
Did you push record again after we took a break?
Yes, it's recording.
Okay. Okay, just making sure.
Thank you. That's basically this threshold markings, the lights, things like that can also affect, if they're not working, they can affect what our legal landing minima are. Is basically what this next thing is going into. If we're using an ILS or if we're using some sort of non-instrument approach. Landing weather minimum. If the pilot in command of the airplane has not served 100 hours as a pilot in command in operations under this part of the type of airplane he is operating, the minimum descent altitude or the decision altitude, decision height, and visibility landing minimums of the certificate holder's operation specifications for regular, provisional, or refueling airports are increased by 100 feet and 1/2 mile, or the RVR equivalent. The MDA or DA, DH, and visibility minimums need to be increased above those applicable to the airport when used as an alternate airport, but in no event may the landing minimum be less than 301. However, a pilot in command employed by a certificate holder conducting operations in large aircraft under Part 135 of this chapter may credit flight time acquired in operations conducted for that operator under Part 91 in the same type airplane for up to 50% of the 100 hours of pilot and command experience required by this paragraph. What this is saying is if this pilot doesn't have 100 hours in the airplane he's flying, so for us, the CRJ 700, so if we have a pilot in command who only has 50 hours in this CRJ 700, he has to add 100 feet to the ceiling of the landing minimum and 1/2 mile to the visibility of the legal landing minimum.
I know it's a dumb question, but that's obviously the model of the plane, not the actual plane.
Yes, the
Right.
model of the plane. So the CRJ 700, that'll be the plane that we use for this class.
Yeah.
It's basically just like a step up from the CRJ 200. I mean, that's the one that flies in and out of St. George. I don't know if you guys have taken that flight or. Yeah, that's the model of the plane. But that's the model of the plane is not necessarily specific to this scenario. It could be any model of plane. It's just if that captain doesn't have the 100 hours in that type of plane, he's considered a high minimums captain. So a high mins captain. And you have to add to his landing minimums to make sure that he can land there.
So you'll hear that that question a lot on tests. This first test that we're going to have it's on there, and then you'll see it in your practical test as well. You'll get asked, what is a high minimums captain? You can say a captain that served less than 100 hours in the type of aircraft. And then they say, what do we do with his landing minimums? You just say, add 100 feet and 1/2 mile to his landing minimums. And we'll go into more about what, I know we're saying the word landing minimums, but when we start looking at Jeppesen charts and start looking at, runway, the approaches that the pilots use to land, this will all come into play. and we'll reiterate it at that point. So don't get too caught up. Just memorize that a highman's captain, we add 100 and a half to his landing minimums.
A big one too is they will ask this, what is the lowest possible? And it's that 301. Has everybody got that?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, applicability of reported weather minimums. In conducting operations in 121.649 through 121.653, the ceiling and visibility values in the main body of the latest weather report control of VFR and IFR takeoffs and landing for the instrument approach procedure of all runways of an airport. However, if the latest weather report, including an oral report from the control tower, contains a visibility value specified at runway visibility or runway visual range for a particular airport of an airport, the specified value controls for VFR and IFR landings and takeoff and straight-end instrument approaches for that runway. So even if our reported visibility or ceiling is less than that of a legal landing minimum, if you call the tower and the tower reports differently, the tower is controlling because everything they have is real time. So a big one for us is the Aspen. And so in Aspen is one way in, one way out. So we land on 15 and we take off on 33. So we can only land on 15. So if there's a 10 knot tailwind or 11 knot tailwind, we can't land on 15. We just have to go to our alternate airport. But if there's a 9 knot tailwind, we can land on 15. So all the time, the current written weather report will report like a 9 knot tailwind gusting to like a 16 knot tailwind. And so you're looking at the gusts and you're thinking there's no way they're going to land. Well, they get there, they start talking to the tower. Sometimes they'll hold for 5 minutes and the tower says, okay, 9 knot tailwind, and they get right on in. It's very easy. But otherwise, if they didn't have that tower, they wouldn't be able to land there. But the tower is controlling there because it's got an instantaneous winds report. Does everybody get that?
Yep.
Okay, so it's not always about what it's forecasted to be. Whatever is the absolute latest is what we can go with. Responsibilities of the dispatch release. Each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations shall prepare a dispatch release for each flight between specified points, based on information furnished by an authorized aircraft dispatcher. The pilot in command and an authorized aircraft dispatcher shall sign the release only if they both believe that the flight can be made with safety. The aircraft dispatcher may delegate authority to sign a release for a particular flight, but he may not delegate his authority to dispatch. So earlier how we were talking about how if you didn't want a flight to go, but the pilot did, it still can't go because the pilot and the dispatcher both have to sign off on this release for it to be good. Now, in today's age, we're just sending over releases electronically. So most of the time, when the pilot starts putting in his numbers for ACARs, that is Well, I may have gotten a little ahead of myself there. When the pilot gets the release and he runs his exact numbers for everything that's on board, and he gets what his takeoff numbers are going to be, that is what is considered his signing off on the release. So there's no actual physical signature anymore. But it is a shared responsibility between the dispatcher and the PIC, that they have to share that responsibility of, is this release safe or not?
How long does that take, like, for both of them to sign off on it? What's the general time frame
So,
after it's done?
okay, so when you're actually looking at a dispatch release, so when I'm at SkyWest and I start, okay, so let's say I've got this Salt Lake to St. George flight. I've been talking about this one a lot tonight just because we're all in St. George. It's easy. So that flight is going to depart at, like, let's say 5 Zulu. I'm going to start looking at that flight about an hour and a half to 2 hours actually before that flight is going to even depart. I'm going to start looking at weather. I'm going to start looking at, all sorts of these anticipated traffic delays, everything that I think of that I know I'm going to need to consider for a safe operation of that flight. I'm going to start looking at all that stuff about an hour and a half to 2 hours out. I send over the flight release no later than 1 hour before the flight departs. The big thing here is that the pilot may actually not even get there until 30, 45 minutes before the flight departs. He might be coming in on another flight, and he doesn't even land at Salt Lake until 30 minutes before he's supposed to take off again for St. George. So as soon as he lands, he can pull up his release online, and when he's looking at that, he may only be 30 minutes away from departure. And when he gets that, he can either look at it and say, no, I don't like this, or yes, I like this. And I'm okay with this, and I think this can operate safely for this flight. What you're kind of looking at there is that sometimes things do change. Like every now and then, conditions change, and you start thinking about things, and you're like, no, I want to change this release, or the captain looks at it and he's like, no, I want to change this release, and you'll call up to each other and you can talk to each other, you can change the release. So this is all happening anywhere between 2 hours and right up until the flight leaves.
Okay.
But most of the time, it happens about 45 minutes before the flight departs. And it's basically just an electronic signature by the captain, and you sending over the release is kind of your signature. Once it's made and you send it over and it has your name on it, that's basically you saying, this is me signing off on this release.
Okay.
And then if the captain decides, okay, I'm going to sign off on this, that's when he starts running all of his data to find out his, takeoff numbers, what the flaps are going to be, stuff like that. That's him signing off on it.
Okay.
Does that all make sense to you? Or Garrett, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think, I think you pretty much covered it really well there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
But yeah, the whole process can happen, and it can happen over again, even if the pilot gets it and he doesn't like it. He may call you and say, hey, I think we need to take another look at this. We need to add or we should add an alternate, or sometimes I add alternates all the time where they're not required, but it's a good idea to have one for maybe like a thunderstorm or something. And so things change all the time, like even right up until right up until the flight departs.
How many flights are you over during your 10-hour shift as a general rule?
So that kind of depends on where you're at and what kind of operation you're doing. So at SkyWest, we're typically looking at, in a 10-hour shift, we're looking at maybe anywhere between 40 and 55 releases in that 10 hours. And sometimes that's a whole lot. Sometimes it's a great weather day and that seems like nothing and you're almost bored. A lot of those are very short. Some of them can be longer. If you start looking into like the major airlines, like American, Delta, Southwest, the airlines that are running a lot longer flights, a lot more cross-country flights, their number of releases is a little bit down from that. If you're looking at some of the international dispatchers at those places, they may only be doing, 10, 12 flights a day. Maybe none, hardly any at all. But it just kind of depends on what you can handle. They're looking at how long is it going to take to make these releases for long flights? How long is it going to take to make all these releases for these shorter flights? Are you going to have to flight follow more for some flights than others? Things like that.
It gets to be more second nature though, like the more you do it, right? So it's not so, you're not so green even when you start.
Absolutely. There's a lot of things that you can set up as far as alerts and things that monitor themselves on your computer so that you can handle a large workload like that. And that it gets to be where, 45 flights at SkyWest is, sometimes it seems like a lot, but a lot of times it's, right now, if it's a good weather day, I mean, that's like sometimes you go in and you start getting bored almost.
I've heard that.
There's also steps that SkyWest is taking. So on those days that are really hard, we just on this new shift bid that we just had, we have what's called an IROP desk, so irregular operations desk. So on the days where it's just crap weather, say at Chicago O'Hare, and we have a ton of flights going into Chicago, on those days, this desk that we've created has an extremely light workload. We're talking like 15, 20 flights or something like that. And they'll be able to pick up flights from those overloaded desks. Does that make sense? So we're getting better and we're evolving as we go through this process. We've, for the first time in a long time, from what I understand, we have enough dispatchers to really, lighten the workload. So it's been really nice to see some of the changes come out that have come out. So
it is really nice too, especially with the amount of dispatchers at SkyWest that we have. There's almost always somebody that just luck of the draw gets an easier desk. And there's always people around you that are willing to take an extra flight. So even if you are, like I've had days before where I'm just swamped and I'll stand up and look at the guy across from me like, hey, can you get on my desk and take 2 or 3 flights? And there's always people willing to help. So it's never a thing that I would necessarily stress about the workload.
Okay. Thanks.
So dispatch release. This is also a huge one as far as test questions, quiz questions, and interview questions as well. The dispatch release may be in any form, but must contain at least the following information concerning each flight. So we need the identification number of the aircraft. So there's going to be an actual, we call it the tail number. It's going to be a number. It's basically that aircraft's particular name. The trip number. So SkyWest flight 1234. Number 3 here is the departure airport, intermediate stops, destination airport, and alternate airport. Just think of all the airports involved in this flight. So where we're coming from, where we going, where we stopping in between, where might we land, things like that. A statement of the type of operation. So are we instrument? Are we VFR? For most scheduled services, it's going to be IFR. The minimum fuel supply. You'll hear people commonly talk about this as minto. So it's the absolute lowest amount of fuel that you can line up at the end of the runway with and take off. For each flight dispatched as an ETOPS flight, the ETOPS diversion time for which the flight is dispatched. ETOPS is extended over water operations. We won't really go too much into that in this class. The dispatch release must contain or have attached to it weather reports, available weather forecasts, or combination thereof for the destination airport, intermediate stops, and alternate airports that are the latest available at the time the release is signed by the pilot in command and dispatcher. It may include any additional available weather reports or forecasts that the pilot in command and the aircraft dispatcher consider necessary or desirable. So on here, we need the plane number, trip number, airports, type of operation, minimum fuel supply. If it's ETOPS, we need the diversion times, and we need the weather for all airports. Garrett, do you happen to have a acronym?
Oh, I so do, and it's a good one.
Oh, I knew you would.
It's super awesome. So this one is damn it. DAMIT. What needs to be on a release? Because there's so much, I always tell myself, damn it. So trying to remember. So D, departure airport, intermediate stops, destination, and alternate airports. You can remember it as departure airport, like you can remember it just as it's said, or you can, D, departure airport, just memorize that D is departure airport, and then just know that that means every airport, right? Okay, A is a type of flight. Okay, that means IFR, VFR. So A type of flight. M, minimum fuel supply or minto fuel. I is ID number or tail number of the aircraft, and then T is trip number. So that's one I would write down, because if you read it like the FAR says it, it's really hard to memorize. But that acronym, damn it, is a good one to remember that. So
this is a big one that comes up at work even. They ask us this one in recurrent this year.
Yeah, and it's one thing that when you're going through training, at least at SkyWest.
Can you repeat the damn it and all the words that were along with it, please?
Yeah, so D is for departure airport, intermediate stops, destination airports, and alternate. So the way I do it is departure, intermediate, destination, and alternate airports. That's the way I memorized it. A is for a type of flight. That means IFR or VFR. So M, minimum fuel supply. I is ID number. Okay, ID number of the aircraft. And then T is trip number. So, I mean, it's just rearranging the order, tweaking the order a little bit, but the acronym is there. So,
Okay.
one thing that SkyWest likes to do in training and recurrent training, the training after you've been there for a year, that they do every year, is they like to pull up a release and they like to go, what's wrong with this release? And there's like some stupid little mistake on the release, like the airports. There's no runway listed as to what we planned. There's, the trip numbers missing. There's But if you remember the acronym, then you can remember that that's supposed to be on that dispatch release. So remember damn it, and then remember that the weather is attached. Just say weather is attached. Okay. It's not required to be on the dispatch release. It just has to be attached to the release. So yeah, that's pretty much how I remember that one.
That's good. I'm glad you had one, because I was just kind of remembered 5 things.
Yeah, this one was a hard one for me to memorize for some reason until I got that acronym. So
All right, does everybody have that? We'll take silence as yes.
Yeah, got it.
Yep, I got it.
So that is a big one. Luckily, you don't have to memorize the supplemental operation one. You guys can just all take joy in that. Okay, so distribution of load manifest, dispatch release, and flight plans, domestic and flag. The pilot in command of an airplane shall carry in the airplane to its destination a copy of the completed load manifest or information from it, except information concerning cargo and passenger distribution, a copy of the dispatch release, and a copy of the flight plan. The certificate holder shall keep copies of the records required in this section for at least 3 months. Can you imagine why anybody would want to keep these things?
In case there was a crash, discover the source, like if anything was dispatched incorrectly.
Yeah, stuff comes up all the time where they pull stuff from weeks ago for us, and they tell us, okay, so we did an audit because we got tipped off about something that was going on with our flight planning system, and then they look at all these flights and things like that, and so they look back at that stuff all the time for both legal reasons and reasons of the company looking at ways to improve and stuff like that.
yeah, but let's say that you made a mistake on a release. You get a really cool letter from NASA saying, hey, we've recorded that you made a mistake. So how many jobs do you know out there where you get these cool letters from NASA? I know my wife, when I got my first letter from NASA, she was like, what is this? They're recruiting me to be an astronaut, honey. Forget about it. So
my sister, I'm not sure, still knows that those are bad. I think she thinks that NASA's really looking at me. I have them sent to my parents' address still because I move so much.
Okay, so how often did they send those?
As often as you mess up and know about it.
yeah, so as soon as you're notified of the mistake,
you guys messed up a lot then, huh?
Well, it's not necessarily. You will mess up. It's guaranteed. You're going to. If you give me odds that you're not going to, I'm betting against it every single time. Things are going to happen. You're going to screw something up. It doesn't matter how much time you took on every release, how many times you double checked and rechecked and did everything. You're going to screw something up at some point. The biggest thing to do there is that when you find out about it, because most of the time you find out about it within, like 30, 45 minutes to an hour. It's because the pilot will bring it up to your attention, or you'll be looking back at something and you'll be like, okay, all right, admittedly, so there was one time where I don't know what happened, but I thought I had planned an alternate for this airport. And so it's getting close to my I'm following this flight. I'm like, yeah, man, it's getting close. Like, okay, And I went back to double check and check a fuel burn to a different airport, to a different alternate. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, oh no, there is no alternate listed on this release. And so I know, and then I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh no. So this flight actually took off, and I was like 100% I had an alternate on it. I thought it was going to Chicago. I thought I had Milwaukee as the alternate. I was 100%. I was totally confident I had planned it that way. And I go back and look at the release, and even the pilot left without one. He looked at it and like didn't even question it. He just leaves, just hops on the plane and goes. And so we're halfway there, and I'm trying to change the alternate and realizing I don't even have an alternate. So you find out about them really quickly. What these letters are is that you reported it yourself that you messed up, and it's kind of like then you get protected. And because you reported it, it's good for you because you get protected, and it's good for them because then they can learn from these mistakes.
Yeah, and kind of some backstory behind this. We call them ASAPs. Back not even too long ago, the FAA, could walk up, FAA inspector could walk up to you, find a mistake like missing an alternate on a release, and after so many, or if it's like he's got something out for you, he could pull your license and you're done. You're not a dispatcher anymore. It didn't happen a whole lot, but there were times where it was like just a super negative thing. The relationship between the FAA and pilots and dispatchers and everybody pretty much in aviation was a very negative relationship. And so the FAA has changed how they how these reports and how these different problems are uncovered. They've really changed their aspect to as far as seeing, we've got this negative, connotation, this negative image that we've got to fix because people are hiding problems and not telling us about them because they're afraid of punishment. So they changed how they did all of that, and this ASAP reporting is the solution to that problem. It's an absolute, like, unless it was done intentionally or you were on or under the influence of drugs or alcohol, 100% of the time you will not be held accountable as long as you reported it. So that's why they have this system now. As far as this FAR, the pilot carrying these three things to the destination, this is one that you will see on a test. Know that it's the dispatch release, load manifest, and a copy of the flight plan. So those three things, just memorize it like that. Don't memorize all the information around it. Just say load manifest, dispatch release, and copy of the flight plan. So.
All right, I think we can finish up. I think we got one last thing down here in the red. We can go over that real quick, but I think we're coming to our end of our time here tonight. Communication records. So each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations shall record each en route radio contact between the certificate holder and its pilots and shall keep that record for at least 30 days. This basically means they're going to keep all the information that you sent to the pilot. So let's just say that you're the dispatcher on a flight and it's getting to an airport, and that airport all of a sudden reports that their runways are totally iced over. And they see that you never sent anything to that pilot, giving them a heads up on, the runways are iced over, or that you sent it and that the pilot just ignored it. Either way, they want that information to be able to go back and look and see, okay, whose fault is this crash? Now, Yeah, I mean, just like we were saying there, we like to be friendly with the FAA. It's always good to be looking, friendly with the person who's looking after you. They are also going to look and see who's at fault for things. So you have to be diligent about flight following and about making contact with your pilots about safety of flight issues, because they're going to keep that stuff and they're going to look at it if anything ever goes wrong.
Yeah, definitely. And remember that one of the primary three things that the dispatcher is solely responsible for is for that flight following. Monitor the progress of each flight is the verbiage. This is our job, 100%. So we need to be, like Davis said, we need to take that very seriously and be very diligent in our flight following. But yeah, is that the last one of the night, or like the last one on this document?
That is the last one on this document.
Oh my gosh, I think this is the fastest we've ever completed the FARs.
I mean, it was speedy fast. I think everyone can attest to how dry some of it got when I was reading it.
Yeah. How soon is all these available on YouTube after you guys do it?
Mine will be uploaded tonight. Sometimes the videos take a really long time to convert. So mine's done converting this morning. I've just been gone literally all day until right now. So mine will be uploaded tonight. Davis will probably be uploaded tomorrow sometime. So
yeah, I'll start converting it tonight, and then I should get back into St. George tomorrow, and I'll upload it then.
What do we look under again to find them? I mean, what?
So just on our YouTube channel, just go to the Aircraft Dispatch Academy YouTube channel, and then look under the playlist for August 2018.
Okay.
Okay.
And of course, if you guys ever have any questions, you can email any of us and tell me how bad of a job I did, and that I should explain it to you further. So don't hesitate to ask questions, because this stuff is going to build on itself. Like we were talking about earlier with the alternates, 1 hour before, 1 hour after. And then I pulled up that TAF, and I know the TAF looks like a foreign language to a lot of people. It's going to build on itself. So if you don't get something now, you need to say something, because everything's just going to get harder.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions from tonight?
Well, probably the TAF, but we can figure that out some other time.
Yeah. We'll go into depth into each one of these subjects. The FARs are, a lot of it's like dictionary language right now.
Yeah.
We're figuring it out, but we're going to really dive deep and dissect these charts and this flight planning stuff that we got to go through. So just keep your head up. We'll get through it.
A lot of this will get brought up again too. We'll refer back to 121.533 operational control. We will refer back to that one all the time. We'll refer back to the 123 rule. I mean, a lot of this stuff gets brought up, and there's a reason why it's in here, but you may not really see it in action until later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jared, are you teaching tomorrow?
Yeah, I'll be teaching tomorrow. I'll be down in St. George too. So.
All right. Well, we finished off at the end of this.
All right. Perfect.
Sounds good. I'll see you at work soon.
Yeah, we'll see you guys. See you guys later. We will on Friday. We'll go over the quiz. We'll do a quiz review on all of our FARs and the last couple subjects we cover this week. So just know that the quiz will be on Monday, and we'll do a thorough quiz review on Friday. So
Great.
All right. Sounds good. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.